Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of CNF Talks, in which we interview speakers and contributors to our upcoming events. Today, I have with me Alec Peachey, who's the founder and editorial director of Transport Plus Energy. Alec is going to be speaking at our EV Infrastructure Summit on the 9th of April, kindly being hosted by KPMG in Canary Wharf. Alec, welcome.
Thanks, Maurice. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you with us. When you and I last spoke about a year ago and spoke about the state of the EV charging market, you gave some very interesting commentary. How would you describe the progress that we have made since then?
Yeah, I think the progress has been generally quite good, Maurice, to be honest, in terms of the number of charge points and the infrastructure rollout. Obviously, there are a number of charge point operators who are working very hard to get the right chargers in the right places at the right time. I think that we hit a target of around 55,000, I believe it was, in the most recent OZEV statistics. Might be slightly out there, but around that figure. Obviously, we know the target by 2030 that the government have set is 300,000. So there's still some way to go, of course. But I do think that there's certainly a lot of effort and work happening to make sure that we do roll out the charging infrastructure at the required rate, and to also do that in a socially equitable way. So we need to be thinking about the urban and rural areas, of course, across the country, and not just having a concentration perhaps in the southeast. It's got to be done across the country to make sure that that volume of charges is reflective in different geographical areas.
Yeah, it's good, but 55,000 with a target of 300,000 by 2030 still sounds like quite a lot of work ahead. And the government appears to have rowed back a bit on some of its net zero ambitions recently, as indeed has the opposition. For instance, the delaying the ban on new petrol cars from 2030 to 2035, the OBR estimates that this will delay consumers switching to EVs. What impact do you think that will have on the provision of EV charging? Will people ease up in the belief that the transition to EVs is going to be slower?
Yeah, it's a good question. As you say, the current government and Rishi Sunak obviously made that now perhaps infamous announcement, I think back in September, that they were going to roll back the deadline from 2030 to 2035, of course, for the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles. I think Labour actually have recently come out and said that they would reinstate the 2030 deadline on the ban new petrol and diesel vehicles. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it has unfortunately created a little bit of uncertainty, of course, in the market, and that can knock a confidence of a charge point operator, of which there are many. I think there's over 100 charge point operators in the UK. Which is quite a lot. So what you might see, of course, is a consolidation of the market, which I think is perhaps inevitable in future years to come anyway, as you would probably see with petrol and diesel forecourts at the moment. I mean, it would predominantly be perhaps a few players that are involved where people are filling up their ICE vehicles. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily you'd see such a drastic reduction that it would only be 4 or 5 CPOs, but in the future we might get to, of course, a much more consolidated market, and you're probably starting to see that consolidation happen in some areas already in terms of those CPOs that are perhaps reinstating some of the legacy infrastructure that's out there on the network. So they're adding to their existing charge points that they've already got by taking on board and improving perhaps some of the legacy charging infrastructure that's already out there. So that's, of course, adding to their numbers, but it might not be adding to the total number of charge points that are in the ground, because they're obviously reinstating and reinvigorating existing infrastructure. But of course, I don't think the problem we have is that by rowing back on the deadline, it has created uncertainty in the market.
Yeah.
Anecdotally, friends of mine have perhaps now said, well, I'm not going to get an electric vehicle just yet because the government have pushed
Mm.
this deadline back. So it has had an impact, but I think that you'll see the private sector still continue to drive it forward, because I still think that there is a lot of positivity. Just this week, we've seen news that a Chinese player might come in and invest, of course, in a giga plant, the
Yeah.
West Midlands factory.
Yeah.
So, this is the sort of support that we need. We need that confidence, and the government, whoever
Mm.
the government might end up being, to really
Mm.
sort of put their mark in the ground and get behind this industry, which we know has so many economic opportunities, of course, that can
Yeah.
be brought about through this. The one thing we don't need is uncertainty and the
I
possibility
agree.
of slowing it down.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're making long-term plans, you want to be certain that the parameters aren't going to change. So, let's hope that that there is now a more certain framework for people. Maybe we have to wait to the election for that. But turning to another topic, local authorities are obviously a key player in the provision of charging infrastructure. What are the particular challenges facing them, and what are the opportunities? And I ask that question against the background of many local authorities having quite serious economic problems at the present time.
Yeah, they have, Maurice. Yeah, I mean, the problem with local authorities, of course, always is that they have such a myriad of things that they have to deliver on, whether that's
Mm.
adult services, children's services, highways, of course, EV charging infrastructure rollout now. There's a lot of competing demands, and they have to
Yeah.
stretch their budgets ever further than what they've had to do previously. And now you throw in the EV charging infrastructure rollout, which of course is supported by funding such as the local electric vehicle infrastructure fund, the Levi fund, which is quite a good pot of money that's being facilitated by Cenex and PA Consulting and the Energy Saving Trust, of course. I think importantly within that, we spoke before, Maurice, about the fact of EV officers, dedicated EV officers coming into those local authorities and being able to sort of push the agenda on and be able to understand more what is needed, of course. But it is against that backdrop, as you say, of financial difficulties with many authorities,
Mm.
and it's worth remembering, though, that a number of these local authorities have declared climate emergencies, of course. So it
Yeah.
is in their interest to do this, and as they come under perhaps increasing pressure from their residents to provide the charging infrastructure, then of course it moves more up the agenda, and therefore budgetary or money is more likely to be sort of presented or made available to hopefully deliver that. But I think the challenge is still in upskilling those officers, making sure that they're collaborating between different departments. Net zero or the rollout of EV charging won't be delivered just by one department. I think it needs that collaboration across things like planning, highways, procurement, the EV officer themselves, and of course they need to engage more widely with other stakeholders as well. And importantly, they need to learn from one another. If there are neighbouring
Mm.
authorities that are looking at this geographically and saying, well, we're going to roll out X number of charging points, they need to talk
Mm.
to their neighbouring authority and find out what their plans are. And is there a
Yeah.
way they can be more joined up on this? How can they deliver that charging
Mm.
efficiently and effectively? So I think that
Mm.
we will need to see more of that going forward, but certainly collaboration being a key
Yeah.
word between, say, the charge point operators, the energy networks, and the local authorities themselves, and internally within the councils.
Yeah, and presumably, joint ventures with private sector partners will alleviate some of that financial pressure for local authorities, that there might be different business models that can be used.
Exactly right. Yeah, I mean, you're already seeing that, certainly with a number of the on-street charging providers, who are
Mm.
entering in and helping local councils. I think sometimes there can be a hesitancy with local authorities. They get worried about, will some of the infrastructure stand the test of time? But I
Mm.
think as we're seeing technology improve, perhaps those fears are starting to be allayed.
Yeah. The final question, there could be many further questions, but in the interest of time, you mentioned the concept of social equity. in terms of the rollout of EV charging infrastructure. Obviously there's a clear incentive to build charging infrastructure in cities and probably on motorways. But what sort of policies, what sort of government policies do you think might help in the provision of charging infrastructure out in other parts of the UK, in the rural areas and so on? Is there something government could do to help promote this?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, I think Labour have said that they would reintroduce the 2030 ban on the sale
Yeah,
of new petrol and diesel vehicles. So that in itself would reinstill that market confidence
yeah,
in terms of seeing and ensuring that charging infrastructure is rolled out in those various different areas. Of course, you've got a number of combined authorities across the UK, so
mm,
perhaps there needs to be more policy going on at a sort of mayoral type level, where you
yeah,
see the likes of Transport for Greater Manchester or Transport for the North. Perhaps that direction needs to come, at that regional,
mm,
if you like, devolved level. And if that happens, then it puts that focus on those different regions and
yeah,
ensures that we do get this socially equitable rollout. But of course, ultimately, we need the confidence from central government who set the overall policy, the DFT,
mm,
OZEV, of course, the Office of Zero Emission Vehicles, and the rest kind of filters down. But of course, if we can have that help at a regional level as well, then I think all of those things combined will see us roll out an efficient and effective charging network.
yeah, yeah. Very interesting. But sadly, we're out of time. I'd just like to say to our viewers, if you'd like to hear more on these issues and hear from our other speakers, we have a tremendous lineup at the event, which is the EV Infrastructure Summit, being held at KPMG's offices in Canary Wharf on the 9th of April. We very much hope you'll be able to join us in person. Alec, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts with us.
Thank you, Maurice.